We are discussing the buildup that started even before the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941, and how that builds up to the point where you see the passage of Executive Order 9066, which occurs on February 19, 1942. This is about 3 months or so after Pearl Harbor. So during this period, we see the heightening of paranoia and hysteria that envelops the country. And as I mentioned, especially on the West Coast, this was so. And you see military and government officials meeting, top rank officers of, for example, the Justice Department and the War Department, meaning to discuss even the constitutionality of the evacuation of the Japanese from the West Coast. Now, while the War Department, today we call it the Department of Defense, but back then they called it the War Department. The War Department was in favor of evacuation and relocation, but the Justice Department, and this is understandably so, the Justice Department deals with justice. And if they're going to evacuate a whole entire race from the West Coast, that's a clear violation of their legal rights even as citizens, right? But even non-citizens, the Issei, it's still a clear violation of their rights because it's protected by the Constitution and therefore clearly unjust. So the Justice Department is not really the governmental department to deal with this. So it was basically passed on at this phase to the War Department. So again, it's important to note not all officials were anxious to imprison the Japanese. But once it went into the hands of the military, that's where you see this decision being made with full support of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. So it was determined that imprisonment, that actually evacuation and imprisonment, could be justified if the reason put forth for this abridgment of their constitutional rights was directly connected to military necessity or national security. Now, the final decision on the military side would fall on the shoulders of General John L. DeWitt, who I introduced earlier. So let's read a passage by him. Let's read the rationale as to why the Japanese should be evacuated. So here on the slide is General DeWitt's official rationale that is then sent to the president as to why the Japanese should be evacuated and ultimately put in prison camps. So let's read the introduction first. Decision to evacuate. President Roosevelt relied heavily upon the recommendations of Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War, when he implemented Executive Order 9066. Stimson relied upon Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, the commanding general of the Western Defense Command, with responsibility for West Coast security. The justification for evacuation was military necessity. General DeWitt's February 1942 recommendation presented the following rationale for the exclusion. And here's the quote by DeWitt. In a war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on U.S. soil, possessed of U.S. citizenship, have become quote-unquote Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. To conclude otherwise is to expect that children born of white parents on Japanese soil sever all racial affinity and become loyal Japanese subjects ready to fight and, if necessary, to die for Japan in a war against the nation of their parents. All right, let's analyze those few sentences here through the lens of Orientalism. Let's recall Orientalism presumes the lack of ability or the incapacity of persons of Asian descent or Orientals to fully assimilate and acculturate to Western culture or American culture in this case. So he says here, and this should have stuck out to you, he says, racial affinities are not severed by migration. So when you analyze that, what is he saying there? Racial affinities are not severed by migration. Well, according to DeWitt, it doesn't matter if this person from the Oriental world migrated to the United States. Okay, the fact is they are still foreigners. They are still, in this case, Japanese, no matter what. Okay, so moving on, he says the Japanese race is an enemy race. Okay, that is absolutely true. And while many second, third generation Japanese born on U.S. soil possessed of U.S. citizenship have become quote unquote Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. So there we go. There's another argument that DeWitt is making that is founded upon Orientalism. Okay, first of all, he's saying this, that, no matter what, Japanese are going to be Japanese, right? Regardless of when they migrated. They could be second generation, third generation even. They may be Americanized, so to speak, but no matter what he says, and this connects to this, or not severed by migration phrase, this phrase here says the racial strains are undiluted. No matter what, the race of that person remains, in this case, Japanese. It does not dilute. Okay, and he uses the term strains, right? Racial strains. And then he almost gives you a thought experiment. Hey, can you imagine white children, right, born of white parents going to Japan and completely severing all their connection to, or their affinity. By the way, affinity here, racial affinities and racial affinity stated here means connection. So he says it's inconceivable to imagine anyone who is white and of white parents to fight for Japan and to die for Japan. So likewise, the same logic should apply to the Japanese in the United States. All right. Now he goes on to say that Japan is allied to Germany and Italy. And he says here, it is not ground for assuming that any Japanese barred from assimilation by convention as he is, though born and raised in the United States, will not turn against this nation when the final test of loyalty comes. So again, he's stating there, I don't care how, assimilated they are. In fact, the fact is that you can't trust them. They are not going to be loyal. And here's a bit of convoluted logic at the very end. He says, the very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken. Okay? So that clearly is really bad logic. Basically saying, hasn't happened yet, but you know what? That is just proof that it's going to happen. All right? A complete non sequitur, meaning it does not follow, right? The second argument does not follow from the first premise. Okay, so hopefully it's obvious to you here that how DeWitt thinks of the Japanese, since they are indeed Oriental, as completely disloyal. Why? Because no matter what, regardless of generation, to use his own terms, the racial strains are undiluted, or the racial connections or affinities are not severed by migration. Okay, no matter what, they are Oriental, and in this case, Japanese. And therefore, they're Japanese, you can't trust them. Okay, they're not American, no matter what. So again, it's this peculiar way of thinking about persons of Asian descent back there, that they are forever foreign, that they can't assimilate. Of course, it seems absurd today, in the 21st century to think like that, but this was a taken for granted assumption by many people back then that lasted clearly into the 20th century. So again, connecting this to the early argument, sure, national security, or to use their term, military necessity, was the official justification put forth to imprison the Japanese. But underlying that, right, the undercurrent that's running through this whole argument is Orientalism. The Orientalist beliefs that the Japanese, no matter what, cannot be loyal to the United States, and therefore we cannot trust them. They're indeed going to serve as a fifth column. We must evacuate them from key positions in the West Coast and move them inland in these prison camps. Okay, so now the executive branch, the president, listens to the War Department and they agree, they support evacuation. So indeed, you have the issuance of Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942. And the result of this order would indeed be the internment of about 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. By the way, there's a very few number of them, but if you were, even partly Japanese, right, biracial, let's remember the one drop rule, well, you are also instructed to report to ultimately be imprisoned. Now, out of that 120,000 that would be interned, that would be imprisoned, roughly 2/3 of them were Nisei, meaning that they were citizens, okay? But again, whether you're 1/3 of this group, the Issei, or 2/3, the Nisei, you are herded into these concentration camps. And again, they're located in the middle region of the United States, the Midwest or even the Southwest. And some of them would be incarcerated for up to 4 years. And actually, just to dial back a little bit, once Executive Order 9066 was in effect, the first thing that was done was a curfew for all, quote unquote, enemy aliens and all persons of Japanese ancestry, quote unquote. So during the daytime, the Japanese could only travel to work. They couldn't venture beyond a 5-mile radius from their place of residence. And then by the end of March, you see these bulletins posted up all over the place where the Japanese could be found, and there are instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. And basically, it's instructing them to report to an area where they would be bused from there, that area, to what's called assembly centers, which is basically temporary housing for them while the camps are being built inland. So if you were Japanese back then and evacuation was underway, you had to get rid of all your stuff, all your property, because it's going to be confiscated. And many were forced to sell their homes or businesses, if they had it, at bargain prices, their automobiles, because if they couldn't sell it, well, that's it. It's going to get confiscated, their homes, their cars, or what have you. Now, their bank accounts would be frozen. All their liquid assets were frozen. And they're only told to bring like some toiletries, some beddings, extra clothing, and everything else had to be left behind. Even your pets, couldn't bring no pets, no private property whatsoever aside from those very small items. So obviously this notion of property here, their property, which is again sacrosanct in the minds of Americans, right? Private property, that is being confiscated. They're being denied that. And they're told to report to, again, assembly centers. In the Southern California area, that would turn out to be the Santa Anita racetrack. If you're familiar with LA, okay, you've heard of the Santa Anita racetrack, which is nearby, kind of Altadena and Pasadena. But you report there, and you're going to stay there for a period of, how many months till they build the camps, till they complete them. And then from there, you'll be sent to the inland areas, right, away from the West Coast.